This lecture continues with the Hellenistic period, following the Roman occupation and the spread of this new dramatic and theatrical style throughout the Mediterranean world.
The Hellenistic period will last from the death of Alexander the Great in 323 BCE until the fall of ancient Egypt to Rome in 32 BCE with Cleopatra.
While Alexander the Great's influence was certainly felt all the way to India, we see the rise of Rome taking place in the 3rd and 2nd centuries BCE until in 146 the Roman general Flaminius conquers the Macedonian army and Greece officially becomes a Roman province. Shortly thereafter, the great kingdoms and the cosmopolitan cities set up by Alexander's generals, such as the Attalids at Pergamon, are going to will their kingdoms as well to Rome in 133 BCE. Thus Rome continues eastward, conquering all of the territories once held by Alexander the Great. As part of this, Didyma is going to be an example on the continent of Asia Minor here, where modern-day Turkey sits, of this development of anti-classical architecture that will become appropriate under the imperial rule of Rome. So the anti-classical styles we noticed last time at Pergamon and other areas are very strong in the east, away from the classical center of ancient Greece itself on the Peloponnesus. So the architecture that we looked at last time, such as the temple of the Olympian Zeus, that expanded greatly on earlier peripteral temple designs like the Parthenon, are on an imperial scale. They are monumental, theatrical, and are designed specifically and intentionally to break classical rules. Here we find an example of such architecture with Paonios of Ephesus and Daphnis of Miletos, who are the architects for a structure that was built for over 500 years and never completed, though it was begun in 313 BCE. The Temple of Apollo at Didyma, Turkey, is going to show us the expansion and developments of the classical style of architecture in this late era that adopts specifically anti-classical approaches. Here we have a temple that is designed to replace an earlier archaic temple that had been sacked and razed to the ground by the Persians in 494 BCE. Building, as mentioned, would continue for half a millennium on this, although it was never completed. We have a very original building that would remind us of the great altar of Zeus at Pergamon. Now, the sanctuaries and the temples to Apollo are going to function similarly to those on Delphi, where we find the sanctuary and temple of Apollo would be there for the Pythia and for oracles to deliver messages, as people would give them votive offerings and then priests would interpret them. The dipteral plan seen here, which is a double peripteral colonnade instead of a single row of freestanding columns on all four sides of a rectangular temple. Now we have two rows of these columns, as seen here on the outside. Now this is designed to enclose a smaller temple inside of a courtyard, whereby we have a larger temple on the exterior. A plan makes this more evident, as we see here. The traditional design of a peripteral temple, such as the Parthenon, which was the largest at the time when it was built, is going to have a roof that covers the central cella or naos, with one row of columns all the way around and two pediments on either side. Here, we have a dual set of columns, dipteral colonnade, if you will, that runs all the way around this temple, framing this oracular room where we have an oracle, such as the Pythia at Delphi, where we would ask questions that then would lead to an inner courtyard and an inner shrine where priests would then go and pray to the gods, specifically the god of prophecy, which is what this is dedicated to, Apollo. Here we can see a reconstruction with the roof on the exterior leaving the central section and courtyard open, and a smaller shrine therein lies, much like a mini or small version of a traditional Greek temple. Now, the design, as mentioned, is to allow visitors to ask Pythia questions, whereby thereafter a priest would enter that interior shrine to pray and get answers for those who visit. So just like the Temple of the Olympian Zeus that we discussed, designed by Casucius, this Roman architect, we have breaking traditional and classical rules here with 2 rows of columns and an open interior space. The facade in this instance is going to be made up of 10 Ionic columns that are 65 feet tall. That is 10 feet taller than that of the Temple of the Olympian Zeus that reaches only 55 feet. Thus, the scale is going to be much, much more compounded and multiplied, thus giving us a different way in which to engage with these architectural structures in the Hellenistic age that will be the predecessors for great Roman monuments to follow them. The classical orientation can be seen here relating to the algebraic formula, and thus the relationship between the short and long sides, say of the Parthenon's octastyle temple versus the number of columns on the long side. In that instance, it equals 2x plus 1 equals y. In the same interest, we find that in the classical formula seen here at the Temple of Apollo, the algebraic formula will be 2 times 10 plus 1 equals 21. And so we find that this is a very interesting approach to understanding the classical elements in a geometric and a mathematical fashion. But everything else about the temple is going to be anti-classical. Now, what is interesting about the structure and those that develop in the Hellenistic period is that it does not have a roof or pediment. Thus, it is hypaethral, just as the temple of Zeus at Pergamon was. And so we find this interest in these open-air kind of shrines that develop. So just as the reconstruction shows here of the altar of Zeus, we have this idea of walking up to and engaging with the structure, and thus we also have another shrine or altar on the inside of this hypaethral structure. So this is going to provide a very elaborate frame, that being the dipteral nature of this temple on the exterior, for a very elaborate central courtyard. And so it's a very interesting understanding of having a temple that really is designed as an incredibly elaborate parapet, or a small wall that would surround a sanctuary in earlier classical temples. Now, the design of Greek cities are going to be very influential for ancient Rome as they spread throughout the known world. And it would be Hippodamos of Miletus, who is going to be a classical architectural and urban planner who lived in the 5th century BCE, the classical period, would develop these designs for cities that would be carried out a century after him. So we find that his designs for Greek cities included theaters, they included an agora, they included an acropolis, and of course streets that are based on a grid-like pattern. So the Persians would leave the Greek cities in ruins after they attacked in 479 BCE, especially Athens. And so reconstruction began thereafter based on Hippodamos's designs, which were always going to be grid plans regardless of the terrain, such as seen in these other areas like Piraeus, where we find that it's built on an uneven hillside. And so these can be seen throughout Asia Minor in Turkey on these very rocky outcroppings next to oceans or ports. Here we see that carried out in the city of Priene in Turkey, where on the side of a hill we have this regularized grid-like pattern that takes advantage with regards to the Acropolis, or the highest point of the city, where we have the temple, as well as the theater, which is built into the side of the hill. We find that even though we have this sloping hillside and this rocky outcropping, we still maintain a grid-like pattern or structure, just as with Pergamon. Now, this grid-like plan would come under the control of the Romans as they expand, and they would use it as they adopt other technologies when they come across cultures for their expansion across the Mediterranean.
Turning to Samothrace, we have one of the most famous Hellenistic sculptures that today sits in the staircase to the Louvre, introducing you to its collections. Here, at the Sanctuary of the Great Gods, we would have had an entire sculptural ensemble and/or fountain, which would have been an interactive experience. For in front of it, we would have had a ship, who on the prow is going to land the goddess of victory. Now this is on a hillside with a temple and a fountain, and so right next to this we would have heard the spray of the ocean, the surf lapping against the side of this island. The effect would have been even more appropriate and engaging, and once again bringing us into the moment when Nike alighting on a warship would have been seen with water also spraying against the prow of this ship. Now this is going to be the upper basin of a two-tiered fountain, and her head and arms would have been, of course, present as she alights on this warship, securing victory for those that are going to be sailing it. The Hellenistic component here, obvious because it interacts with the surrounding environment, as though a ship has actually sailed out in front of this temple. In a multimedia experience, the prow of the ship would have had water lapping against it, the crashing waves we can hear not only from the fountain, but the sea below. The feel of wind billowing her chiton we could also feel up here on the top of this hill. The figure itself is going to dramatically be posed in a sensuous S shape, revealing the contours of the body with this wet drapery as the chiton she wears, this thin garment, clings to her body as she struts confidently forward, landing on this ship with her right leg forward, left leg back, her arms outstretched. The S shape taken from and developed on top of the designs seen in the late classical era. We talked about last time with Praxiteles and Lysippus. This gives us a much more sensuous, appealing, and engaging figure and pose. Nike, the goddess of victory, would have been landing here on this ship. The wind we would feel standing in front of it can be seen billowing in her chiton as it's going to very loosely cling to her body, revealing the female form here. Though Nike is never shown nude, we certainly can understand the artist cared to represent the anatomical differences between the female and male form. Her arms would have been outstretched as in other representations, the right arm always crowning the victor, for it is the right hand, the righteous hand, that does so. Another interactive sculpture that is perhaps even more famous in certain areas is going to be the Venus de Milo, nicknamed because that's the Roman name for the goddess and the collection it was in. This Aphrodite is going to be created by Alexandros of Antioch on the Meander. Obviously his name was Alex and he is from a town of Antioch on the Meander River. In this instance, we know that we are emulating very self-consciously an earlier classical model. For the figure is based on the Aphrodite of Cnidos by Praxiteles. The figure turns very coyly to the right. We find that the arm would have been placed just over the pelvis, the right arm, while the left arm is raised once again, just like the original. However, these heavy rounded forms are even more voluptuous than in the original version, and the S shape is even more pronounced, thus showing us that Alexandros is attempting to maximize the sensuous appeal that we see here. We can find that the right leg supporting all of the weight is going to find that the left leg is lifted up. That is going to shift the hips even more dramatically, and thus the upper part of the body is going to tilt to the left even further than in the original pose. If we look at the figure in the round, we note that we are intended to see it in the round, for it is contorted in a very important self-conscious way. The upper part of the torso twists to her left, while the lower leg is going to sensuously be trying to cover her own nudity by twisting back to her right. Therefore, the upper and lower parts of her body move in opposite directions, forcing us to walk around it to appreciate this very volumetric and very voluptuous figure. Now, in walking around it, we would have noted that with her arms present, she is not merely standing there, but is engaged in a narrative act. Now, the form that is going to be moving from one direction to the next ensures that we must engage with her physically, and we would not fail to note that with her right arm, she would be slowly slipping her drapery off, slowly undressing. With her left arm, she would be holding an apple. The fact that she was holding an apple with her left arm and slowly teasing the viewer with her right tells us where we are in a particular narrative, a very famous one for the Greeks, that they could recite from memory. The myth illustrated here would be immediately recognizable to the ancient Greeks, for it is the beginning of the Trojan War described by Homer in the Iliad. In the beginning of this story, we find that the goddess Strife is not invited to a very important wedding held by the gods. So she shows up and throws a golden apple into the wedding. Later traditions state that accompanying the apple is the statement, "to the fairest." Three goddesses immediately begin squabbling over the apple, believing that they should have it. Those goddesses are going to be Athena, Aphrodite, and Hera. We find that Zeus does not allow strife at this wedding, so he sends the apple down for Paris, a Trojan prince, to judge the three women. This offers, in art, the opportunity to show three different types of female beauty in various states of undress. In the original judgment of Paris, we find the three goddesses are going to tempt him with their various wares. We know that Athena, the goddess of wisdom, offers him wisdom and, of course, knowledge, more so than any other man. He would be the smartest man in the world. We find that Hera, the queen of the gods, is going to offer him dominion over all of the land. He could be general of generals, king of kings. Aphrodite walks up and strips down and says that he could have a woman that looks like her. Obviously, he chooses poorly and decides to give the apple to Aphrodite. What Aphrodite fails to mention is that the woman is Helen of Troy and that she's already married to the king of Sparta. So this sparks the Trojan War. In this instance, of course, as part of a narrative, we know that we are playing the part of Paris, that she is teasing us. She is stripping for us in this way. So it is overtly erotic. Now, the Aphrodite example here is no longer being modest and covering up. Now she is very purposefully plying her wares.
The erotic engagement with the spectator is not going to be solely related to heterosexual encounters or images of nude women. Instead, we also have images of male figures that are seen as passively seducing the spectator, and also hermaphroditic ones. So here in the Sleeping Satyr, otherwise known as the Barberini faun, since we have a faun or a human youthful figure related to those spirit-dwelling satyrs that are going to chase nymphs out in the wilderness. They have, in this instance, human legs, however. So here we have one that has drunkenly fallen asleep on a panther skin. So it has also been argued that this is going to be Dionysus, the god of wine, since he is shown with a panther skin, thus relating his Eastern orientation and where he comes from. Now, the statue was discovered in the 17th century and restored by Bernini, especially the right arm. and the right leg. One can see where the left knee is going to be reconstructed here as well. Now, this is interesting because the very subject is not even conscious. We find that he is dreaming, thus being the antithesis of classical rationality, that we can control our world, our actions, and our environment with our minds in a very intellectual and rational way. In this way, we have no control over dreams, and certainly not the erotic impulses that come from them. So looking at Praxiteles earlier on in the 4th century, we can see that he begins this sensuality, this appeal that is going to add additional fleshiness to his figures, the prolonged and very pronounced S-shaped pose that they have. But it's not overtly erotic. It is subtle in its erotic intent, much like the clinging wet drapery that we saw in the classical era for women. Now we have a figure who is laid back, spread eagle. And so we find that number one, the armpit being exposed is going to be the cue in the history of Western art all the way through the modern era of inviting attention from the spectator. This is someone passively seducing you. And this is used both for male and female figures. So obviously we as the spectator are meant to walk around, engage with this figure, and also take them, if you will, in an erotic way. And if anything is left to interpretation, we can of course forget about that, because the entire fulcrum of the image focuses on his genitalia. And so we find that it is impossible to get around the idea that this is erotically appealing for the audience. We find the same type of pose can be seen in the wonderful example of Pan, the satyr-like figure in the St. Louis Art Museum, who also exposes his armpit and is going to spread his legs, drunkenly falling down over a panther skin and a goat skin. So this notion of sensual and sexual empathy is going to be the opposite of the rational intellectual approach that we saw in the classical era. Instead, these figures are going to engage us, beckoning us to interact with them, and appealing to our base sentiments, to our emotional drives and impulses. We find that it's not surprising. It's at this time we see the invention of the hermaphrodite and the hermaphroditus, such as the Borghese hermaphroditus here in the Borghese Gallery, whereby the Greeks invent this tradition of a young, beautiful woman laying in an inviting way on a bed with her back exposed in this dorsal view, with her leg teasing the spectator, lifting it up. And as we engage with the figure and walk around it, we then realize that she has a penis. And so you have this type of erotic delectation, realizing this upon walking around. And one must remember the pederastic tradition is going to be anchored into the Mediterranean tradition from the ancient Greeks and passed on to the Romans. And so we must remember that young boys were seen as erotic objects.
The opposite promise of pleasure can be found here with pain in the seated boxer. In the seated boxer, we have a very popular pastime with the ancient Greeks and Romans, and that is pugilism and or boxing. The figure is seated, he is life-size, and we are of course meant to walk around him, looking down on him. When we do, we notice that his face is covered in lacerations. It is swollen and bruised and bleeding. Just like the Riace warrior before him, the Greeks used different materials for the lips, the blood, the eyes, in order to highlight the differences in the texture, the flesh, the blood. He obviously is not the winner of this bout. He is going to be the loser, looking up at the winner. Now, was this figure part of a group like we might believe Epigonos' dying Gaul was, as he's looking up either at a warrior, another boxer, or us? We can also take the place of the boxer looking down at him. We did this to him. We are looking down at not the winner, we stand in the place of the winner, but instead are looking at the loser of this competition. We walk around the figure and hence are meant to physically engage with him and empathize with his pain and suffering. He is hunched over. He is defeated. His posture tells us that. His face tells us that as he is broken and bleeding. His hands show us exactly what ancient boxing was like, with these leather thongs tied around them that could, of course, deliver a major punch and blow, yet protect the knuckles and the bones in the hands simultaneously. So if we compare this to the Riace warrior, we can see that in the Hellenistic age we are moving from the heroic potential of an ideal figure, an ideal warrior with ideal human anatomy, to a pathetic understanding, someone who is broken, he is lost, he has competed, and he has failed. Then this is meant to evoke not an intellectual response to consider the possibilities and potential of humans and humanism, but instead to consider the emotional and physical consequences that we all must bear and can relate to. We all can relate to pain and loss. We all have lost something at one point.
Just as the seated boxer is anti-heroic and does not show the victor, but instead the defeated, we see here this type of an old hag, as it is known in Western art, of an old market woman produced between 150 and 100 BCE, after Roman occupation of Greece. Here we have the figure carrying out a narrative and an action as she is going to make her way to the agora, the center of every Greek city, whereby you have the exchange of goods and services. So she brings 3 chickens and a basket of vegetables. And we know that this is not a portrait of a specific woman, but instead a physical type, for we see it over and over again, of a young, beautiful type and an aged hag. So the figure is missing its arms and part of the face, but enough survives to indicate the sagging skin and breasts, the overlaying of the nasolabial folds, and the jowls forming on the neck. So we find that even though we have the antithesis of a young, beautiful example with a Nike versus an old hag in the old market woman, they both are assertively outstretched and walking in the same way, right foot forward, left foot back, drapery cascading around, showing how active they are. And both are going to be appealing to us in a very emotional way. They're looking for an emotional response from us. So what do we have here? Perhaps, as many has argued, since it is a type, we have an aging, dissolute follower of Dionysus, one of these Maenads, who is on her way to make an offering to this god, having dedicated her life to drunken orgies and eating raw meat. We see how this has not gone well for her, and perhaps we should feel compassion and empathy for this figure. Now, turning to other types of portraiture that do not heroize and idealize, but instead, as in the example here of Polyeuctus and his Demosthenes as great orator, we see a portrait that is designed to do more than just ennoble. Instead, it captures this frail man's personality and his essence. Here we have a sculpture that is full length, set up in the Athenian Agora in 280 BCE. That's 42 years after this orator's death. Now, what we know about him that can be seen in the portrait, for we have the disfigurements, we have the unidealized naturalistic aspects of his portrait carried out here that the Romans will so love in Verism, where we have a frail man with a speech impediment who is known for his courageous moral conviction, for he was an army veteran who fought against Philip II in the great battle of Chaeronea. He rallied the Athenians against Macedonian imperialism, not wanting the Macedonians to take over all of Greece, arguing for democracy. Therefore, because Philip II wins and conquers all of Greece, they're going to capture him, but he commits suicide by poison before being captured. Much like, of course, Socrates, who's going to be seen as this great martyr later on, is going to to drink hemlock and commit suicide, so too does this great orator and champion for democracy stand in the same way. But we are celebrating here not his frailty. We're not celebrating the fact that he was a coward. Taking one's life was seen to be a heroic act, as we talked about with a Gaelic chieftain killing himself and his wife by Epigonos. So here we have a figure that is not ennobled. He does not have a perfect physique, nor do we have the lack of wrinkles and perfection in his face. He has a downcast gaze, with his hands nervously clasping together. He is not self-assured. He is not upright and dominant and in command of the situation. So we understand the frailty that goes along with his conviction. Much like we see the type of seriousness and grave demeanor in the seer that we talked about at the beginning of the classical age at the Temple of Zeus at Olympia. So the expression here is going to be one of sadness and inner pain, where we see the sorrow manifested on his face over the tragic demise of democracy as Alexander the Great will eventually take over and form this great empire. So what we can see from Demosthenes and the old market woman here is that cosmopolitan individuality is going to win out over as kind of ideal homogeneity, which is only possible when you have a group of people that are like-minded, both in language, religion, ethnicity, race, etc. Then you can have this notion of an agreed-upon ideal. Since we do not in a new cosmopolitan world where we have people from all over this great empire that is created by Alexander the Great and then the Romans after him, it is impossible to have this notion that we would agree on a particular type.
At this time, we find works like this one by Alathandros, Hagisandros, and Polydoros of Rhodes. The Laocoön, a very famous sculpture that will influence the Renaissance to such an extent that there would be no Sistine Chapel ceiling without it, for it was unearthed in 1506 in Nero's Domus Aurea. In the statue, we have an elderly Trojan priest with an ideal musculature and body, with his two sons being eaten alive by serpents. The story comes to us by way of Virgil, a Roman poet for the first Emperor Augustus, in his Aeneid, which chronicles the founding of Rome. In it, this Trojan priest of Poseidon is punished for either having sex with a woman in Poseidon's temple and having sons, or rejecting the Trojan horse that the gods wanted to come into the city. He famously is going to state, "Beware of Greeks bearing gifts." He gives us the famous axiom that you should always be suspicious of something your enemies give you. In the statue, we find that the artist must have been familiar with the altar of Zeus at Pergamon, for the figure of Alkieneos is going to be the model for Laocoön here, the priest, as he struggles in pain, in agony, against Athena here. We find that the snakes that were his legs now become his undoing, as the sea serpents sent by Poseidon devour him and his sons. His purpose is to protect Troy, and so he has a rather benevolent, magnanimous purpose for his actions, rejecting the Trojan horse that brings death to the Trojan civilization. Yet we find that his heroism is still shown in the ideal musculature, his character, his ethics. All of this are going to be shown in his body, this ideal body, while his haggard old face shows us his age. This was meant to be viewed in the round with these life-size figures, now in the Musea Vaticani, or the Vatican collection in Rome. We find that in it, the figure is going to twist and show us externalizing his agony that will be used ad nauseum again and again by later artists. It is an incredibly influential and powerful work that we are able to empathize with, understanding the pain of this figure, and then of course learning from it. Now, the pathos that is experienced here is tragic. We're looking at the painful death of these figures that in one tradition did nothing wrong, and so it is tragically heroic. The portrait-like verism of the face showing his age is going to give way to the ideal body, which is going to be appropriate for the Romans, who do the same thing in their own portraiture. They show the character of someone in the body while carefully recording what they looked like.
The same sculptors likely produced the large sculptural installation of Odysseus and his men, that being Athenodorus, Hagasandros, and Polydoros of Rhodes, would create the same type of effect with the upward turning gaze, the eyes open, the deep drill work in the hair, as we can see the emotional aspects of this dramatic event unfolding. The event would have been part of a multifigural composition with the massive giant Cyclops Polyphemus, who trapped Odysseus's men inside of his cave and ate them alive, until one night they get him drunk on fortified wine and put his eye out with a spear working in tandem. And that is the event that we're looking at here. A very popular subject in ancient Greek art, where we find that these various figures are going to be attacking, working together, this massive passed out behemoth. They are going to be set up in such a way that we walk through them, involving us in the event, as they are just a little bit larger than us, a little bit larger than life size. We are then also pitted against this massive Cyclops who will eat us if we do not assist them, just like we saw with the Nike of Samothrace, a very engaging type of environment and presentation. So the scale of the figures, again, are just going to be slightly larger than us, and we walk through them, seeing this behemoth and understanding that the force and the skill and the weight of the spear that it would take to rescue ourselves, right? A very physical kind of interaction and theatricality. Therefore, we find that it is emotion, not logic, that will dominate the art of this period. And Greece would then be the inventor of this nomenclature, while Rome would be its propagator. Next time, please review your flashcards and notes and prepare for the second midterm, especially watching the midterm review first.